Welcome to it, a Star Wars show. I'm your host, John Justice. Really excited to talk all things a galaxy far, far away once again this week. You can always email me, and many of you did over the course of the past week, talkshownerd@gmail.com. And if you're enjoying the show up on YouTube, leave a comment there. Well, Andor is over, and boy, did it deliver in a way that I honestly never anticipated. Being soft somewhat on the first season of Andor, the second season, and the way that they ended up doling out, if you will, releasing the 12 episodes worked really well, in my opinion. And I'll tell you that I cannot recall a time that... Like, I can go back and think about other series, whether it's Rebels to a certain extent, Bad Batch, for example, The Mandalorian to start, where as a family, we were all gathering to watch Star Wars. This was probably the most... trying to choose my words correctly. I just got done doing my weekly radio show, and so I'm trying to make sure I choose my words appropriately regarding the experience that my family and I had, my wife and my two sons, 18 and 22 years old. But probably one of the most emotional that we collectively got, certainly the most involved and engaged together as a foursome in watching what they were able to accomplish with Andor. It was absolutely stellar. Do I think that all Star Wars needs to be like Andor? No. But I think that to expect Star Wars to live up to the quality of what we received in Andor certainly is something that they could go and accomplish in just how well the show was executed. It's also changed my opinion, I'll be honest, about some of the criticism that the sequel trilogy has received. I'll get to this in just a few minutes here on the show. But my overall impression with these final 3 episodes, and knowing what I know about this article I'm going to share with you, wherein there was another episode that was supposed to give the introduction to K2SO that was scrapped over budget concerns. And that at one point, episode 9 of Mon Mothma's speech and her escaping from Coruscant was supposed to actually take place in the final 3 episodes. I kind of wish I hadn't known that going into watching 10, 11, and 12, because I found myself watching the storyline play out and then wondering if this was the intent all along, to do this detailed of a... And again, spoilers here, but Luthen's demise and Clea's involvement and her getting off of Coruscant was initially part of the plan, or if her storyline was expanded because of the changes in one having to ditch an entire episode relating to K2SO's introduction and, well, not only to us, but to Cassian Andor, and the fact that they moved some of the episodes around. It didn't diminish the experience for me. I thought episodes 10, 11, and 12 were absolutely spectacular. But knowing what we were leading up to and how everything was leading into episode 12 and its connection to Rogue One, which it did absolutely flawlessly, I couldn't help but think what changes were made. That being said, I was really pleased to see that we ended up with a fleshed out story and a backstory, which was always intended, by the way, according to the writer and showrunner Tony Gilroy. He had actually told Stellan Skarsgård, who plays Luthen, that, and Skarsgård demanded that this was the case, that they would do a backstory to Luthen, of how at one point he was working in the Imperial Navy. You know that in the flashback, which took place on Naboo, even though it wasn't explicitly spelled out, it was Naboo where he ended up meeting up with Clea on that ship, and the outfits that they were wearing were very similar to the Imperial uniforms that you saw Han Solo wear, Alden Ehrenreich, in the Solo film. But that was a storyline that I wasn't expecting and didn't know that I wanted until I saw it. Clea is one of my favorite characters in the series overall, and I'm really looking forward to going back and watching the first season now, knowing what we know now in the second season, because I know it's only going to go and enhance my viewing experience. But the way that they handled those episodes and leading into the final episode, which really took care of all the necessary, crossing the necessary T's, dotting the necessary I's to perfectly set up the introduction to roll into Rogue One, which the family ended up watching right after we finished with the last 3 episodes. I had to go and leave to go do some work business, but when I got home, they were already halfway through Rogue One, and I even, before I went to bed last night, watched the very beginning of Rogue One. I intend to watch the rest of it this weekend just to see what the experience was like, and I was right. It really enhanced that viewing, knowing now the backstory completely of what took place in the events leading up to Rogue One, and I just thought they did an absolutely spectacular job. And with that, I'm going to double down on what I said last week.
This is not going to go the way you think.
I think the original trilogy needs to get the Andor treatment. And I'll address my comments that I made last week and the many comments that I received from you over my suggestion that they reboot, essentially, A New Hope. New set of actors, even go so far as to maybe redesign some things. Being specific and explicit that this is set apart from the canon version of what we know of Star Wars. And again, I'll talk about this more when we get to the listener feedback portion of the show this week, because a lot of emails came in regarding that. But after watching Andor, I want to see the writers, I want to see the entire creative team behind Andor carry us now past Rogue One and follow the rebellion into the original trilogy. In the events that take place alongside Han, Luke, and Leia. I want to see the rebellion and the inner workings with new characters, why they ended up on Hoth. What was the Rebel Alliance doing in the interim during the events of The Empire Strikes Back before we meet back up with the rebellion in Return of the Jedi? We can do another set of episodes. You can almost do, almost a 2-hour movie. You could say, let's say we're doing 12 episodes. You can do 3 of those episodes based solely on the Bothan spies and the Death Star 2. You have an entire storyline relating to the Death Star 2 being built that you could end up introducing and bring this serious adult approach to the events that we saw in the original trilogy, and even give us those events from a different perspective. I think that would be absolutely amazing. I'm not expecting that will happen unless Andor Season 2 ends up being this massive runaway success. And while the streaming numbers haven't been spectacular, apparently the signups for Disney Plus have been incredibly positive. And so I don't know whether or not that's going to lend itself to Disney in the future greenlighting a project along the same lines, using the same type of crew, or if Tony Gilroy even wants to go and get involved. Now, I will say, with Andor Season 2 and all of my praise for the show, it is still lacking for me in a couple of different areas. And they're really minor things, but the fantasy element of it has been stripped out, and I know that was by design. I did appreciate that it was brought in Season 2 with the Force-sensitive woman on Yavin. The idea that Bix may also be Force-sensitive as well, which plays into the very final shot in the show. And what I'm talking about is the revelation that Bix has a son, and that son is Cassian Andor's as well. And my takeaway, and the takeaway of many other viewers, was that the final shot that we see of Bix walking out into the field with the child, looking off into the sky as the music begins to soar to a crescendo, that particular moment was the same time when Cassian ended up meeting his demise, meaning she could sense through the Force that he had reached his end and his story was over. Now, it's interesting, too. I'll bring this into the mix. I suggested this to the family last night, and then today saw some interesting evidence pointing to this particular theory. And I theorized last night that perhaps the son of Bix and Cassian Andor could end up being Poe Dameron. Now, if you go back into canon, I know they have a bit of a background on Poe Dameron, but his birthplace was Yavin, from what I remember. And there was an interview that was done now that the show is over, a spoiler interview with both Diego Luna and Adria Arjona, who played Bix, and she was specifically asked, does the child have a name? And she kind of cagey said, no, I can't say. And then Tony Gilroy was asked the same question, and he basically passed it off as his identity is not revealed in the show. No, I know there'll be those that would complain and say we're shrinking the universe, but it really would be an interesting angle if Poe Dameron did happen to be the son of both Bix and Cassian Andor. I think that would be a really, really interesting development. And this could lead into some of those projects, especially the films, and specifically the Rey Skywalker film that takes place 15 years after the Rise of Skywalker, to go and introduce that particular idea. I think that would be really a really cool thing to see. But the series was just top down excellent, and some of the greatest Star Wars that I've seen, and an experience with Star Wars wholly new in the way that it really drew you in. The second season of Andor turned into what I had originally hoped Andor was going to be, and I didn't get in season 1. And I was really hoping for a Star Wars, a Game of Thrones equivalent to Star Wars, or a Star Wars Game of Thrones equivalent. Because Game of Thrones, which is a series that I love, it has a lot of things I don't like in it. I don't like how extreme it is and how graphically explicit it is. I think it's completely unnecessary. I'm not a prude by any stretch, but it's just not necessary. That being said, I thought the storytelling was fantastic within the Game of Thrones series. And in the first season of Andor, it just was a little slower than I wanted. Didn't have as much pew-pew. And I think there's a reason for this, and I'll explain of why Season 2 was so much better than Season 1. And I'll get to this in just a moment. But Season 2 really did suck me in and give me that drama and the intrigue, and then also adding in a little bit more of the elements that I want to see in my Star Wars, while still missing some of the things. And this is where my chief complaint would come to is, some of, the more diverse set of aliens, a little bit more familiarity. I'm not talking fan service, but just things that sort of lean more into Star Wars that you expect. I think it did a very good job. I feel like the series could have done just a little bit better. But I also think that was due to the limitations of the budget, and this is the point that I wanted to make, was that in this story, the Andor creator reveals scrapped K2SO horror movie. This is a change from the canon version, which was initially in a one-off comic book that gave a depiction of Cassian meeting K2SO. That's been completely scrapped. However, there was an episode that was written wherein K2SO would have been captured inside this container after the Gorman attack, and it turned into essentially a horror movie. They had to bring this huge, ugly container ship to Yavin, and there's this KX unit that was trapped inside, and he was inside hunting. It was sort of like a monster movie with a K2 on it. It was really cool. It came down to a matter of economics as to why it didn't get filmed. We simply couldn't afford it. It was made clear that it was out of the range, and so we had to abandon that and consolidate things. That consolidation meant moving up Mon Mothma's big Senate speech, which was originally slated for Episode 10. The downsizing was not the first time that this happened to the brothers Gilroy. It's like what we did with Aldhani in Season 1. Danny Gilroy wrote the Aldhani episode pre-COVID, where there were like 2,000 people in Aldhani. It was like Glastonbury. This was a huge festival. And then by the time we got there after COVID, well, you'd be happy to get 150 people there. We were like, OMG, we have to change the whole story now. Everything had to change. Now, the vanishing of the K2SO standalone episode, however, stemmed out of logistical concerns. Not from logistical concerns, but from financial. And it highlights the changing landscape in streaming on Disney+. and others throwing tons of money into the streaming wars to a much more measured and cost-cutting approach by the studios. The whole dynamic and economics of everything changed between Season 1 and 2. Season 1, it was like, OMG, Pearl Harbor was just bombed. Build aircraft carriers as soon as possible. We don't care. Size, scale, build it. Go Game of Thrones. Money is no object. Make it. Those times are gone now. By the time we got to Season 2 and Bob Iger came back, everything had changed, and everything was belt-tightening. It's hard to ask for more money when they're laying people off at Disney. And this is the point that I wanted to make. Because maybe this is why Season 1 wasn't quite as exciting, in my opinion, or compelling as what we ended up getting in Season 2. There seems to be universal praise for Season 2, while a lot of people love Season 1, and it's all subjective. There were individuals like me that kind of felt it was lacking a bit. And I think the reason is that they were given a bit of free range on Season 1, apart from the changes that had to be made post-COVID in terms of the budget cutting. But when they got to Season 2, they ended up having to really zero in on just what they wanted to film to get the best stuff out there and to maximize their dollars. And this goes back to what George Lucas had initially did with Star Wars and what made Star Wars so great. Now, granted, George Lucas went back and he made the special editions, and I'm glad that he did. I agree with his assessment in doing that, and I think the films are better for it. But the original film, that less is more approach and making good with what they could do and the limitations really lent itself to just how great that movie ended up being, and subsequently the original trilogy that we received. And there's a lesson to be learned there. I mean, sometimes less is more. Sometimes when you have those financial constraints, like what they were dealing with in the second season of Andor, it lends itself to being more creative in the storytelling and really zeroing in on the stories that you want to tell. And while if you had told me heading into the final 3 episodes that we would get essentially this 2 and almost 2.5 hour story arc and the background on Clea, I kind of would have been like, okay. I mean, I really like her as a character. She's one of my favorite characters on the show, and I should say secondary characters. I think Cassian's my favorite character. However, what we got was fantastic. And even though it was kind of a different riff on Mon Mothma escaping Coruscant, it was altogether so new and different that I just found myself on the edge of my recliner watching those last 3 episodes in that particular story arc specifically. So the last thing that I want to say on Andor before we get to your listener feedback this week is that change in view that I have based off of what we've seen with Andor, specifically relating to the criticism that so many fans have had over the lack of a clear, definitive plan for the sequel trilogy. Now, I say this because I love the sequel trilogy for what it is, even though we do have 3, dramatically different films. And I'll still continue to go watch the sequel trilogy. Now, all that being said, the criticism of those who talk about how disjointed it is highlighted in how well Andor was executed. It's a little unfair in terms of a comparison, considering we're talking about a trilogy of films, spanning 6 hours, probably more like 7 hours when you kind of include the runtime for the films. That being said, and a series that needs to be mapped out. But Andor certainly goes to show the kind of storytelling that you can do when you do clearly map everything out. The amount of callbacks that took place and the payoffs in Andor Season 2 were spectacular. We had Melchi's gun that was in the last week's block that was handed to him in Season 1 that is pulled off of the table and asks you whose gun is this, and you see Melchi there and identifying that he ended up escaping from the prison and now he's a part of the rebellion. In the Dedra and Luthen confrontation in his antiquities shop, the fact that she brings the stolen Imperial item that we used as the MacGuffin to bring Cassian and Luthen together was just a brilliant callback. So the show really does demonstrate how important it is to tell the story and lay it out. And when we were done, I couldn't help but scratch my head and go, man, can you imagine this level of storytelling in terms of quality and writing in the sequel trilogy? Even though I love the sequel trilogy and those 3 films for what they are, and suddenly I went, okay, I get what the complaints by so many of the fans were. I think there are varying degrees with that. I think you can say, I wish they had planned it out, whereas the fandom menace takes it way too far. But my attitude certainly changed, whereas I really didn't ever criticize the sequel trilogy for being disjointed. I understand the value more now after watching Andor, which, again, was just simply spectacular. And I use my wife as a gauge because she was not into Andor at all. And now she wants to go back and watch Andor Season 1, and she sat down and watched Rogue One last night with my oldest because she found Andor Season 2 so captivating. What are your thoughts? Email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or drop me a comment on YouTube.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, first off, at Star Wars Santa. Check out his show on YouTube. Blasphemy, John. You're going to get in a lot of trouble with this reboot the original trilogy nonsense. Smiley face. All kidding aside, I see your point. My youngest daughter would agree. For her, the original trilogy looks old and outdated. A modern retelling, without changing the story, could attract a younger audience to that specific era. For me, the sequel trilogy provides a modern look for a modern audience. Telling more stories in the sequel trilogy era will do a lot to bring in the younger audience and more audiences as well. I wouldn't touch the original trilogy. And again, my idea was more of just like an experiment. And I guess that's probably the point that I should have stressed a little bit more. I mentioned the one-off comic called the Star Wars, which was based off of George Lucas's original treatment for Star Wars. And I think that's where my mind went, was do another Star Wars film, reboot A New Hope, and do it again, but do it for a modern audience, and just make sure that you're putting out there, this is out on its own. We just want to tell this story that was told in A New Hope in a fresh and new way with new characters. And just, again, with a complete understanding, just like you do with the Batman films, that this film stands on its own and does not replace the canon films that we've all grown to enjoy. Let's see. Breenism92 said it would be funny if they rebooted the trilogy and then had to re-edit Rogue One to remove the spooky CGI Leia and replace her with whoever played the reboot Leia. It's what George would do. That's a really good point. NickyMan557 writes this. How about we make new movies instead of endlessly reviving the already existing films? Why not do both? I just think it's time to start examining Star Wars from a different angle, and one that doesn't make the existing content just so precious and the original trilogy so precious that we can't ever touch it. I just don't agree with that. It doesn't diminish the original trilogy. Doesn't mean you can't watch the original trilogy. You can avoid whatever new stuff they make. I'd love to see a fresh and modern take on it. I mean, that film is 50 years old. Let's see. Mark Coons of 5197 says, hands off the original trilogy. It is the basis of everything, and a reboot would destroy the foundation. One does not tamper with film classics. I'm more in favor of a reboot of the failed prequel trilogy. Without silly Gungans, without Roger, without the XX pod races, without a whiny Anakin, without tons of CGI. But here's the thing, Marcus, you completely negated your first point with your second point. One could for many individuals, for millions of people, the original trilogy is their classic films. And they would make the same argument that you're making. It is the basis of everything that leads into the original trilogy. So everybody's entitled to their opinion. It's all subjective, but your statements, kind of cancel each other out. To say hands off the original trilogy, but reboot all of the prequel trilogy. Okay, well, Make it make sense. All right. Ann Black, 1948, writes this. Great commentary. I love how your appreciation for Andor has grown over time. I'm completely open to a remake of the original trilogy, especially if the Gilroy team is handling it. Andor-level quality and the attention to detail is the standard they should strive for moving forward. Thank you, N. Blackie. Sorry, forgot the E part. Thank you, N. Blackie. Let's see. Ray, 2017, writes, on this May the 4th, so this goes back to May the 4th, I watched The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker on the 24/7 live stream Star Wars from Disney+. Watched 4 episodes of Skeleton Crew and the Rebels season finale episode. I guess I'll be watching that every year. And I watched Star Wars Underworld. Yeah, I think I failed to mention that I watched Star Wars Underworld last week. I really, really enjoyed it. I thought both the stories were incredibly compelling. The animation was great, and it was fun to see the backstory of Cad Bane and Asajj Ventress. Is it anything that I'll go back and revisit? Probably not. Same thing with Tales of the Empire and Tales of the Jedi. I might go back and revisit Tales of the Jedi. But that being said, I really did enjoy the Tales of the Underworld. And I hope they keep making them. All right, let's go to at 88 Strange 88. As much as I would like to see a modernized version of Star Wars, just as you said, it will never be able to recapture the magic of the original. Yeah, I don't think so either, but I will add to that here in a moment. With this current hateful fandom, why bother? Better to create a new stories within the universe, and a remake is a failure waiting to happen. See, I disagree with it being a failure waiting to happen. And in terms of capturing the magic of the original, I don't know. Listen, you're never going to have a Star Wars again, right? You're never going to have the dynamics in play in modern society and the way that we consume our entertainment. It's just not relative to that. But you could have new experiences, new breakthroughs, and I'll point to Andor Season 2 as the example. I had only dreamed of watching a series like Andor Season 2 and having it suck me in to the storytelling the way that it did, and the way that I really had only experienced watching like a show like Game of Thrones in terms of the storytelling being intertwined. I love Ahsoka. I love Mandalorian. Didn't really care for Obi-Wan. Didn't really care for Book of Boba Fett. Those are completely different types of storytelling. Wholly enjoyable, purely Star Wars, but not on a level of quality and intrigue that what Andor was able to do. An experience that I could have only imagined and dreamed of having that I had. So my point being is that never say never on a remake. I should say remake, not reboot. It should be a remake of A New Hope specifically. I'm not saying do the entire trilogy, just do A New Hope. Do a modern retelling of A New Hope. New actors. Again, even fuss with some of the ship designs and all that as a standalone. And you never know. You could end up taking what is a great story and making it a masterpiece based off of certain changes. Just throwing it out there. Never say never. Lastly, friend of the show, Disney, Desi, who I always enjoy hearing from. I can't imagine they will ever redo the original trilogy. However, if they do, hopefully they'll take out the parts where Leia kisses Luke. That's funny. Thank you for that, Disney Desi. And listen, that's it for this week's episode. I'd love to hear from you. Again, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Or if you're enjoying this up on YouTube, leave a comment there. Lastly, before I let you go, you enjoy science fiction. I hope you'll take a moment and check out my own science fiction space opera adventure series. Set in the year 2172, it is a fun, fast-paced, and action-packed epic science fiction adventure without an agenda. It's called EMBARK. 7 books in all in the series. In book 1, you follow Taft Guardia and Keitha Morrow, a pair of pilots, wherein Keitha's father, who died 1 year ago, ends up leaving her, posthumously, the key to saving humanity. She just doesn't know it yet. You see, deep inside D-Corp, the planet's largest civilian and military spacecraft factory, an industrial accident has set off a catastrophic chain of events. Unaware of the disaster, Taft Guardia eagerly agrees to help fellow pilot Keith Amaro investigate a cryptic message from her past. War erupts as D-Corp's ruthless leader attempts to exploit the chaos and seize control. Meanwhile, Taft and Keitha discover what may be the only hope of saving Earth's evacuees from annihilation if they can survive the apocalypse first. I hope you'll take a moment and head on over to Amazon.com. Search for EMBARK, E-M-B-A-R-K, and John J.O.N. Justice. There you will see all 7 books that complete the series available in ebook, Kindle Unlimited, paperback, hardcover, and audiobook. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with sci-fi and support the podcast. Written for adults, but completely age-appropriate for those 11 plus. I hope you'll go and check out my science fiction space opera epic filled with fantastic technology, some romance, really unique action sequences. If all that sounds good to you, then EMBARK is a perfect fit for your next read. Again, head on over to Amazon.com and search for EMBARK and John Justice. I look forward to hearing from you between now and next week, and I hope wherever you are, you're happy, you're healthy, and you're safe. God bless, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My nerd world.